typically called our anaerobic alactic system because it doesn't produce lactic acid. And then this would be our anaerobic lactic system, or our lactic acid system, or anaerobic glycolytic system. So it's got a few terms, but for today, I'm just going to use our lactic acid system. So this is if we're trying to do still that higher intensity work, but for longer than that 10-second period. And so the power output, or the speed that we can maintain, is going to come down from what this immediate energy system can produce, but we're going to be able to sustain it for kind of up to 1.5 to 2 minutes. And so the energy that this system uses to produce ATP is coming mainly from stored glycogen in the muscles. And so glycogen in our muscles is basically the storage form of our carbohydrates. So it's kind of sugars, and that's what our muscle, our body stores it as is in the muscles, is glycogen. So we're thinking about that kind of duration of this system. This might be your sprint qualifier for cross-country skiing, would be in and around that duration. A downhill ski race, if you think about that. Those type of events would rely really heavily on this energy system to contribute most to the ATP required for the effort. And then finally, our long-term energy system. And so there's actually a few processes that are involved in that, but for today, we're just going to call it the aerobic system. Or you can also refer to it as the oxidative system. So the processes involved in our long-term energy system in order to produce ATP utilize oxygen, and that's why you sometimes see it called the oxidative energy system. And so this provides most of our energy during steady state exercise. So if you're going out for a longer, easy effort, just maybe an hour-long run or ski or whatever, but it's not a hard effort, this is going to supply most of the energy demands for those types of training, as well as when intense exercise lasts longer than several minutes. And the processes involved in this energy system can utilize carbohydrates, fats that are stored, or protein, but that's kind of like a last resort for really long, high intense efforts. So primarily carbohydrates and fats are what we think of when we think about what our aerobic system is using to supply ATP. And like I said, so this system is what for most of your racing for cross-country skiing is going to be kind of predominantly supplying some energy. And when I say predominantly, it's because if we look at this graph, we can see that if we think about the durations that I just talked about, and we use running as an example, we've got our 100-meter dash, a 1,500 meter, and a marathon. And so our 100-meter dash, like we talked about, oops, wrong way, is going to rely pretty heavily on that ATP PC system. Our 1,500 meters, so if we extend that effort out in duration, we're going to be relying more on that lactic acid system. And then as we move out really to that extreme end, for sure, we're very heavily reliant on our aerobic energy system. And so one thing I just want to point out here is that when we look at the ATP contribution to these different efforts, it's never 100% to any single one. And so this is why even in cross-country skiing, if we think that, you know, the aerobic system is likely contributing the most to more of your races, except for, like I said, the sprint is obviously a shorter duration based on the distance that you're racing. But all of our energy systems always kick in as soon as we start any given effort. And so what this graph is showing us is if we look here, this is for maximum efforts of these durations. So if you try and go as hard as you possibly can for 10 seconds, as hard as you possibly can for that kind of minute to 2 minutes, and then as hard as you possibly can for longer, your pace changes, right? So if you try and go as hard as you can for 10 seconds, are you running the same speed or skiing the same speed as if you try and go as hard as you possibly can, but maintain a consistent speed for 2 minutes? Or do you have to slow down? You probably have to slow down a little bit in order to maintain a constant speed for that given duration of time. And so what we can see here is as soon as we start an effort, all of our energy systems start to work, but it's because of the rate that they can actually supply ATP that it changes as to which energy system is predominantly supplying the energy for that effort. So it's just, again, important to know that when we think about energy that's being supplied for exercise, it's not just an activation of a series of energy systems switching on and switching off. So, you know, after 10 seconds, it's not like our ATP PC turns off and our lactic acid system turns on, and then at 2 minutes, lactic acid turns off and aerobic turns on. They're all working, they're all contributing. It's just based on the duration of the effort as to what is contributing the most. And there's very much considerable overlap, especially as we get out to the far ends of the capacities of these systems as to what's kind of predominantly supplying the energy. And so, like I said, what really differentiates what's supplying the energy for a given effort when we think about racing and maximal efforts is that rate of ATP production. So how fast can each of these energy systems supply ATP in order for our muscles to use that to do work, to go fast? And we can see here that our ATP production rate of our short-term energy, or our immediate energy system, sorry, is the highest by quite a lot. And so this system works very, very quickly because it's using stores that are right there, immediate to it. There's very few steps in the process to create ATP in this energy system. So it can make it really fast, but it uses it up really quickly as well, all of those stores it has available. And then our lactic acid system is the next fastest at producing ATP. And although our aerobic systems are quite a bit slower when it comes to rate of production, and this is because the processes that these systems use to actually create ATP require a lot of steps. They're very complicated, so it just takes more time, but they yield the most ATP. So they're slow, but they're by far our most efficient, because for the amount of fuel that they're using, they're creating the most ATP molecules. So these are very efficient, but slower. And so high capacity, but low power, basically. And then this final graph, as we wrap up talking about energy systems, is just showing how we can train these energy systems. And so this is looking at, again, that rate of ATP production of our aerobic system that relies on carbohydrates. So an oxidative system. And we can just see that as we train and as we get more trained, the ability of this system to quickly produce ATP required for a given effort, meet the demands of the effort, become much greater. And so we can train these systems, and we can train all of these systems. So we can increase the amount of phosphocreatine that we require for our immediate energy system. We can increase our glycogen stores in the muscle that we need for our lactic acid systems. And we can also increase enzymes that are required for all of these systems to work to produce ATP. So we can train all of these things through creating a stimulus or manipulating our training. And when we manipulate training, we use the FIT principle. So we can manipulate frequency, intensity, time, and type. And basically, we manipulate training intensity by using our training zones. And when we think about training zones, and I'm going to show you guys a table coming up shortly, we really are determining our training zones or breaking these up based on that relative contribution of the aerobic and anaerobic energy processes that we just looked at. So we looked at that immediate energy system, the short-term energy system, and our aerobic energy processes. And when we look at the training zones in just a minute, you'll be able to see that really those are broken down based on, again, that relative energy contribution. So if we look at the pace and the duration, what would be predominantly affecting or contributing to the ATP demand during that? typically we'll use heart rate based training zones. So hopefully you all have your functioning heart rate monitor all good to go. But we're also going to talk about some other methods of monitoring training intensity. And so when we think about determining heart rate based training zones, we can determine that in a few different ways. So we can use either a percentage of an age predicted heart rate max. You can actually use your heart rate max. And so if you do a hard effort that's kind of in that 5-minute long range, that's maximum, and you feel like you couldn't possibly go any longer, if you were wearing your heart rate monitor, you might get a heart rate max towards the end of that type of effort. Heart rate reserve is another way. And then of course, if you ever do any testing, which some of you might have done or some of you might do in the future, you can also get your heart rate based training zones based off of that. So if we look at this diagram here, we can see this is saying, looking at zone 1 and zone 2, zone 3, zone 4, sprint, and speed. And if we look at how they're broken up in the detailed manner, we can basically see that our endurance zone is looking at our aerobic energy processes predominantly. And so our endurance zones are looking at training those aerobic energy processes that we talked about, the oxidative energy processes that are most efficient, but typically have our slowest rates that we can again train as we train those. Anaerobic threshold being the point where we switch from being kind of getting towards equal reliance on aerobic and anaerobic and moving towards really a much greater reliance on our anaerobic energy processes. So if we think about your endurance zone being 1 and 2, zone 1 would be very heavily aerobic. As we move through zone 2, we're kind of getting to more of a balance between our aerobic and anaerobic. And then as we go past our anaerobic threshold, we're becoming more reliant on those anaerobic processes to meet the energy demand or produce the ATP for the effort. Looking at race pace, max aerobic speed, sprinting, and pure speed. And so what I really want to point out here is the different ways that we can monitor training intensity. And so we've talked about the fact that we often use heart rate. And so, you know, we'll use a heart rate range. This diagram here, or table, is showing you based off of a percentage of heart rate max. I also talked about how you can use percent heart rate reserve, or if you've actually done testing, you might have individualized zones broken down in this manner based off of blood lactate or ventilatory measures. You can also base them off of pace. So what this is percent of your max aerobic speed. So as you can see, this would be your top end aerobic speed, very, very high effort. And you can base it off of that. But I would say in the sport that best uses this type of monitoring would be like a cycling, where you can throw a power meter on your bike and quite easily you know, go off of power output, that sort of thing. It's a little bit harder in a sport where you train predominantly outdoors in different terrain and different conditions, that sort of thing. RPE is something I really want to highlight, because what this is rate of perceived exertion. So hopefully most of you are already familiar with this. You might be more familiar with a 10-point scale. So there's different scales that can be used. There's this 6 to 20, which 6 isn't on here because it's sitting there doing nothing, and training is never sitting there doing nothing. So it's not on this, but this is a 6 to 20 scale. You can also have a 0 to 10 scale. And the reason that I say it's really important to get familiar with this and not become too or only reliant on your heart rate monitor is because, for one thing, it's really important for us to know if we start to see a disconnect between these two things. So you should be able to learn that when you're doing your easy training, it feels like easy training, and that's good, and your heart rates and your RPE match. It's when we start to see a mismatch between those two things, like you feel like you're skiing really easy, but your heart rate's way higher than it should be for that given effort, then that's something that you'd want to talk to your coach about, because it could mean that you're tired, or maybe you're fighting a sickness or something like that. So again, it can give us really useful information in that respect. And then also, I work with national teams, and we still have athletes that show up to training, and they've known for a week that their heart rate monitor needed a new battery, and they didn't get it, and now it's not working. Or they need a new soft strap, because those need to be replaced every once in a while as well. So all of a sudden you're looking at it and it's not, there's no way, it doesn't make sense. It's not what your heart rate is. So it is a piece of equipment, your heart rate monitor, and it can fail. And so being really aware of the relationship between perceived exertion and pace is critical. And then finally, blood lactate obviously is something that we can also use to monitor, but I would say that it's most, even at the national team level, we're not taking those frequently enough in the field. We're more always relying on the heart rate range and the RPE. And then the last thing that I'd like to point out here is just all of the literature is showing us that over the course of a cross-country skier's career, most of their training is going to be done in this low end of zone 1, the low end of endurance training. And that is really critical for the sport and for endurance training in general. And so it's really important to keep your easy training easy. And so that's using your heart rate, using your RPE, and yeah, monitoring the intensity during your training is essential, because obviously we have these zones. And next I'm going to move into the reason, we've talked about training energy systems, but what else are we impacting physiologically in order to get the training adaptations that we need to get to improve endurance performance? And cross-country skiing is considered up there as one of the top endurance sports. So what impacts endurance performance? So most of you have probably heard of VO2 Max, which is the maximum amount of oxygen that your body can use, that can take in, deliver, and use by the muscles to produce effort or pace or exercise, race, basically. And so that's impacted by our body's ability to get oxygen from the lungs to the bloodstream. It's impacted by our cardiac output, which is how much blood can your heart pump to the working muscles per minute. It's impacted by your oxygen carrying capacity. So what that is what's the ability of your blood to carry oxygen. And so what's your hemoglobin mass? Our hemoglobin is what carries oxygen through our bloodstream. What's our blood volume? We can increase our blood volume and the total amount of blood in our body as well. And then what's our ability of our working muscles to use that oxygen? So we talked about the fact that we could train to improve enzyme activity, to actually improve being able to use that as well. And then the only other thing I want to highlight here with this diagram is another thing aside from VO2 max, and basically our anaerobic threshold is another really key determinant that we can improve with our training. Another thing that really impacts, and this is research related to running that I chose just because it had a nice diagram, but skiing is the same, is the idea of economy. And what that is how much oxygen does your body need to use to meet the demand of skiing at a certain speed or running at a certain speed. And not only is that impacted by some of the physiological things that I'm going to talk about, and that ability of our body to extract oxygen and all of that, but it's really also highly dependent on technique. And so I can't emphasize enough what a highly technical sport you're in. And as a physiologist, I of course, I'm all about the training effects of different intensities and all of that, but technical efficiency is absolutely critical. And so that's really something you should always be keeping in mind. So when we think about your endurance training zone, some of the training effects that we would look at are developing some of those central mechanisms to deliver oxygen to the muscles. So when we looked at that first diagram of the running man, and we've talked about cardiac output, if we think about that, this type of training is going to influence our heart size, our blood volume, and our stroke volume, which is how much blood our heart can pump out with every beat. And so again, impacting that kind of delivery of oxygen to the working muscles. When we're training at our anaerobic threshold, doing that controlled anaerobic threshold training, we can improve the ability of our body to clear lactic acid and use it for energy. So believe it or not, but that lactic acid that everyone is so, it's a, you know, dreadful word and feels awful, but our body can actually, if there's time, transport it to different areas of the body and use it in our aerobic energy processes to produce ATP. And so when we're working at our anaerobic threshold, our body's learning to be really efficient at that. And it's actually called the lactate shuttle. And it gets used in our liver, it gets used by our heart muscles, it gets used in our skeletal muscle, actually, by certain muscle fibers. So it's used all over to produce ATP. And then it also just improves our ability to function well in an acidic environment. So just get used to working still through that highly acidic environment that doesn't feel good. But we can learn and teach our body to still work under those conditions. And then when we get up to our higher training intensities, so race pace, MAS, our sprint and our speeds, we can look at getting better at, again, our muscles, getting that oxygen out of the blood to use for work. Neuromuscular coordination. So that's basically all of our muscles learning to work together to produce higher outputs or help us be able to ski at really high speeds. Also working on technical efficiency, again, at those high speeds. Increasing the ability of our body to deal with lactic acid through a process called buffering, and also learning relevant pacing. So obviously the pacing that you're going to use in a sprint qualifier is probably different than the pacing that you're going to use in a 5K versus a 10K. And so it is important to learn that relevant pacing so that, you know, you're not going out sprint qualifier pace in a 5K and then crawling across the finish line at the end, right? So we need to learn those pacing strategies as well. And then finally for here, I just want to, again, it's not just about the physiological adaptations as much as I love to talk about those. There's that massive technical component. I highlighted that idea of economy and being able to be really efficient at those submaximal speeds, because we don't race at our maximal speed, right? We race at those submaximal speeds. We want to learn to be as efficient as possible at those speeds. And there's a major technical component to that. And then obviously with skiing and the different techniques you have available to you, you have to learn how to be efficient in multiple techniques. So making sure that, you know, you're learning how to utilize the appropriate techniques for different terrain as best as you can as well. And then before I move on to the last bit on training quality, I just really wanted to touch on the importance of recovery. So what this diagram is showing is a general workout recovery cycle. And what I really want to highlight here is if we have a training stimulus, and this horizontal line here is basically our performance level. And so if we train, we get tired, and we actually usually see a dip in performance, or our body's ability to kind of meet that demand again. We stress it and it gets tired. And so we've got this fatigue that happens, and it's not until we allow for adequate recovery that we actually see supercompensation or an improvement in performance. And so when it comes to getting better as a ski racer and improving your ski speed, recovery is equally important, if not more important, and being able to do a good job of recovery is critical to actually see the benefits of your training. And so the next graph I'm going to show you, this graph is a model that was built on tapering. So some of you might have done a taper heading into a major targeted competition that you had for a season. But it's essentially showing us a similar model in that, so this curve here is our performance, And then we've got fitness up top and fatigue on the bottom. So we've done a training load, and now we're gonna taper or recover heading into a competition. And the really key thing to see here is that fatigue, which is on the bottom here, it goes away much more quickly than fitness does. And so taking a break, doing the recovery, if your coach gives you a day off or a week, an easy week or a taper, and they're reducing the load, it's because what they're trying to do is find that balance of getting rid of the fatigue to the point where it's not masking all of those fitness improvements and performance improvements that you've worked so hard for. So again, we don't actually get to realize all of those training effects that I talked about without the recovery. We don't get to see the benefits of them until we have the recovery, and then we can actually see the performance improvements. And then finally, I'm just going to talk to you about a couple more key things that impact training quality. So we've talked about training zones and training effects and all of those things, but some other things that would impact training quality are health, equipment, and execution are three of the things that I'm just really quickly going to touch on. And so when we look at health, when we're working with national teams, but this goes for any athlete, one of the really key things that we try to track are how many days are we losing or modifying because of illness or injury. And so we really need to try and stay healthy from an illness and injury standpoint. And from the medical aspect, it's not only just about illness as well. And so, you know, it's making sure that we can really try and optimize our health in order to make sure that we're not at risk for getting sick, but also, you know, as endurance athletes, the demands that you're putting on yourselves with the training that you're doing are higher than, you know, me as a generally kind of recreationally active person. My body's not under as much stress as yours will be because of the physical activity and the training that you're doing. And so you have to think about, you know, staying on top of things like your checkups with your family physician, and you know, even your eye health and your dentist checkups, all of that stuff, just trying to stay on top of things so that you know that you're optimizing your health. When we think about musculoskeletal health, again, any areas of concern for risk of injury. So some of you might work with or have part of your programming with strength and conditioning, and quite often, you know, that's trying to make sure that your bodies are strong enough for the demands of the ski technique that you're trying to put it through, as well as the training load that you're putting on it, so that we don't get injured. You know, you might also do kind of a screen with a physiotherapist to make sure that there's no areas that are a risk for injury. And then also, you know, does your quality support optimal ski technique? And so, yeah, just trying to make sure that, again, we're not losing, not only are we not losing those days to illness or injury, but that we're optimizing it so that we can get the most of those training effects and adaptations that we're looking for. And then just finally, are there mental health factors that could limit the ability to train optimally? So, you know, I talked about physical recovery with the diagrams that I showed, but psychological recovery is equally as important. And so, you know, being sure that you have, you know, your hobbies and interests outside of skiing that you can do to get away and switch your brain onto something else so that you've got good balance in your life. And yeah, so just being cognizant of all of those areas of health that need to be optimized in order to get the most out of your training. And then with regards to equipment, and you need to think about your equipment for all of the modes of training that you do, because I grew up a swimmer, and so I spent my whole life swimming back and forth in a pool, and all I needed was a bathing suit and some goggles and maybe a pull buoy and some fins. But you guys do lots of modes of training, right? Lots of you might bike, you run, you ski, you roller ski, so you've got different equipment for the different modes of training that you do, and you should think about it for all of them. really key thing, does it put you at higher risk for injury? So I had a national team athlete last year have a wheel fall off their roller ski while they were skiing down a hill because they hadn't checked to make sure that everything was tightened up properly on a frequent basis. And so, you know, making sure that you're maintaining your equipment, or, you know, your coach can help you or your parents can help you, but just making sure that you're taking care of your equipment. And the other thing that I would say for skiers is make sure that you're replacing your running shoes frequently enough, because again, putting too many kilometers on a running shoe before you change it can also put you at higher risk for some overuse injuries. And then functionality. So again, if you see that battery sign on your heart rate monitor, get a new battery right away. Like tell your parents, go to the grocery store, get a battery, keep some extras at home so that you can change that out right away so that you don't show up to training one day and all of a sudden it's, you know, a week later and it's not working at all anymore. Or if it's just being finicky, try figuring out what the problem is straight away. You know, keeping your drink belts clean, making sure you've got clothing for the right conditions. There's all of these things to consider for equipment that are just as important as your health and as executing the training. And then lastly, execution. So following the plan. So your coaches spend a lot of time developing a yearly training plan, breaking that down into cycles to focus on different training objectives, which are all based around those training effects that we're looking for based on the demands of your sport. So again, being really diligent with your training zones. So use your heart rate monitor, learn your RPE scale really well and become good at knowing what your different efforts and paces should feel like. Keeping technique in the forefront of all of your training. Very technical sport, cross-country skiing. And again, as you get further and further in your career, that economy becomes even more impactful on performance. And so really important to become technically efficient in all of the techniques that you'll use as a skier. And I would actually argue with all of your modes of training. So it doesn't hurt to learn to be a better runner, keeping in mind that you're going to do a lot of running over the course of your career as a skier. Nutrition, which I think you guys are going to have a talk coming up during this camp from a dietitian. I rely really heavily on the dietitian that I work with. It's a huge component for endurance sport and optimizing training. So being really diligent with your nutrition, eating well, recovery, again, we don't get to see the benefits or the adaptations that we've worked so hard for until we have that adequate recovery. And so that means sleeping well, eating well, you know, taking time off when your coach tells you to take time off. And sometimes that time off can mean going and doing another activity, but you should ask your coach because sometimes that time off needs to be rest, which is, you know, staying home, reading a book, doing another hobby that you have that can allow your body to rest and recover. And being diligent with your training logs and any monitoring that your coach is asking from you. So that might be resting heart rate. It might be asking you to track how much you're sleeping each night or what the quality of your sleep is, or maybe just a fatigue score. So they might be asking you to do some of these things and you should really try and do them as frequently as you can because that helps your coach figure out what's your normal profile. And then they can use that to determine if you're getting too tired or if you need more recovery or that sort of thing. And then adapt the plan as needed. So coaches make plans. I help coaches, the coaches I work with make plans, but stuff happens and we have to adapt the plans. But a real key to being able to do that properly is communication. So talk to your coaches, let them know, you know, if you're participating in other sports, what are kind of key periods that might be coming up in your other sports that might need to be kind of kept in mind to balance your ski training with those sports, or family vacations if your family likes to go do, you know, big hikes together or mountain biking or whatever it is. Talk to your coach about that stuff and they can help you work that in appropriately so that it's not taking away from your training, but it's maybe adding to it. And then again, all that monitoring that your coaches are asking you to do. And that could just be training logs. Training logs are the #1 thing that I would love if an athlete ever showed up on the national team and they had 10 years of training logs coming with them. That would be phenomenal. But those are really there to help us, help us track and adjust to keep moving towards your goals. So really important. Again, track, talk to your coaches, do what they ask. If you don't understand why they're asking for what they're asking, have that conversation and learn, because it's always easier to do what we're being asked if we know the reason why. And that's all I've got for today, but if there's any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Are there really no questions? Jess can speak for 43 minutes and no questions come up. I just want to, first of all, thank you, Jess, for that presentation. That was awesome. Really informative. And I know for you, that's bringing together a lot of information where you can talk about for hours and putting it into in a 45-minute piece. So it's challenging as well. There's just a question coming up here. We'll get to that in a second. What I was going to say, though, and it just echoes your last comment there about athletes communicating with coaches. As coaches, we don't want the athletes, we don't want you to be robots and just go and do what you're told and don't ask any questions. It's really important, and part of the reason why we bring Jess along and other experts along to give presentations is to educate you, to give you a better understanding of what you are doing, why you're doing what you're doing. And then that helps to create a better dialogue with your coach and adapt your plan to better suit your needs. So this is all part of it. It just echoes that last comment. A question: when should we replace our running shoes? More biomechanic focus, but any question, any thoughts there?
Yeah, well, I mean, I've always heard, definitely, I've heard runners say like no more than 100 kilometers, which isn't a lot. But I think, you can probably feel it. I would say at least every season, you should probably, if you're doing a decent amount of running in your program, think about, as you start a new training season and you're going to start building into that season, starting with a new pair of running shoes wouldn't be a bad idea. Especially as, cross-country skiers typically do a fair bit of running in your program. And yeah, I would say at least to start a season, it's a good idea if you can to start with a new pair of running shoes. You don't want it to be when all of a sudden you're noticing pain in your feet or your shins or your knees, that then you're thinking about replacing your running shoes. So being proactive with that.
Good. Okay, there's a couple more questions here. Do you need to replace your ski boots often as well? And I'm not sure what you think about that.
I would probably refer to you for that. I'm not sure how fast those break down.
Yeah, I think especially at talent squad level, you definitely do not need to replace your ski boots as often as your running shoes. The more you ski, the more as you get older, the more you will use, your ski boots will break down. And so if they start to not be able to support you, or if zippers get blown, just basic functionality diminishes, and of course you need to replace them. But at talent squad level, you can probably hold on to your ski boots for a couple of years as long as your feet don't grow out of them.
Yeah.
Another running shoe question: do you recommend wearing 2 or 3 pairs of shoes in rotation or just a single pair? Personally, I have 2 or 3 pairs that I rotate through, but my feet haven't grown in 15 years, so that's easy for me to do. I probably rotate between 2 or 3 pairs a year if it's a heavy running year. That's how I work. If
yeah,
that's great.
I would say the athletes I work with, it's a mix. Again, the athletes I work with, none of their feet are growing anymore. And so having a few pairs of shoes, I would say, you know, they'll have different shoes too. Like some of them, they might have a more of a trail shoe, a shoe that they might use if they know they have to be running on pavement. So they'll have different options and rotate through. But if you've got just even one good pair of running shoes to get you through a season, I think that yeah, depending on how fast you're growing as well, like to have 2 or 3 pairs of running shoes that you might grow out of before they are even close to being done would be unfortunate.
Andrew, do you have something to add to that? I know, sure.
No, I just want to say thanks. I think there is a really good segue or a really good connection between what we talked to this morning with respect to goals and a whole bunch of things that Jess has just put out there for you. So you don't have to think of your goals as just being, like we talked about this morning, as just being like an outcome goal, like a placing on a podium or an aggregate combination. There are a host of things in what she's just talked about that can be part of really, really good goal setting. So one of the big things that, that Jess emphasized as well is tracking. If you do nothing but log your training on a daily basis, all of those little tiny habits that you do every single day that build up over the course of the year and then years, you will be way ahead of the game to someone that does that either haphazardly or doesn't do it at all. So look at all the things that she's talked about. We'll hopefully get some of this information out to you so that you wouldn't, if you've furiously madly been writing some notes down, if you're not sure if you got everything, we'll get that information to you, but have a really good look through it. There's some really, really great stuff in there. And whatever it is that you think applies to you, figure out what's important and then figure out how. What are all the little habits that you're gonna use and create and build to make this become not just something that you want to do, but something that actually happens at the end of the day. Okay, so that's great. Thanks very much, Jess. It's awesome.
Yeah, thank you. Then I'll just say I really like that you said habits, because I do believe, especially when it comes to your training logs, you do need to make these things part of your routine. That's the easiest way to get it done. Same with if your coach is asking you to do resting heart rate, make it a habit to do it every morning. It's much easier to actually remember to do it if it becomes part of your daily routine. Wake up, you do it. And then if you forget on a couple days a week, you still did it 5 days a week versus aiming for Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and then it's not part of your normal routine. You forget. I deal with this even at the national team level, and all of the athletes I work with, even at the national team level with the monitoring I do with them, the feedback has just become, I try and do it every day, because if I try and do it every day, I get at least 5 days, and there are the days that you sleep in and you miss it or whatever, but it is just a matter of making it part of that routine, and it's just becomes almost mindless. You wake up, you do it. Before you go to bed, you fill out your training log. It just becomes the part of your daily process so that you're getting it done as often as possible. Because the worst is, I've seen it when athletes try and fill in their training logs kind of 2 weeks after the fact, the information that's going in there isn't quite as useful as it might have been as if they were filling out each day.
Jess, there's actually, I know we're a bit over time here, but there's 2 questions.
Yep.
First one is, what happened to the roller skier who lost their wheel? Question, concern if they were all okay.
They were actually fine. It was very lucky. Don't ask me how they were fine, but just a few very small scrapes. So it was very lucky.
We missed a little bit. We lost a little bit of you there, Jess.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Oh, yeah. I'm getting some weird feedback. I can hear feedback.
But they were fine?
Yeah, all good. No injuries.
Good. And then how do you know when to stop recovery so that you don't lose your fitness but still recover properly? Which is a big question for sure.
Yeah. So the way that your coaches plan your training is typically they'll plan the training load in such a way so that they're anticipating that based on the load they've given you, whatever recovery they've sequenced in is appropriate. And that's where some of that monitoring comes into play. So if you do kind of 2 or 3 weeks of training and then your coaches give you an easier week, you know, if you are doing your resting heart rates, if you are doing your sleep scores, that sort of thing, then your coaches will be able to see if you've recovered adequately at the end of the block that they've put in. But your coaches have done a lot of education on their training block lengths and loading and how much recovery is required, and so ultimately, you know, all of that monitoring that you do for your coaches is going to help them determine if the load recovery or the stress recovery balance is appropriate throughout the training season. And I would say it's pretty rare that based on the residual effects of the training that you do, that you would, you know, with the recovery blocks that your coaches probably sequence in, that you would be at risk of ending up on the wrong end of that fitness fatigue balance. If anything, the important thing is that your coaches can see that you are recovered at the end of your recovery block. Because if you're not, then you might need to extend it, because if you start training again before you're recovered, you might not even come back to that line where you were at the beginning. And that's what we call if an athlete's getting kind of overtired or overreached.
Thanks.
Welcome.
Well, I think that's it then.
Okay.
Thanks a lot.
Awesome. Well, I'll PDF my slides and send them to Matt and Andrea, and they can circulate those so that you guys can have them.
Good. That will be really useful for the questions that are part of the worksheet.
Yes.
And everybody got this today. Okay. Well, have a good night, guys. We'll see you again in the morning. It's 10 a.m. tomorrow, not 9 a.m., 10 a.m. so that our BC team coaches can join us.
Awesome. Well, enjoy the rest of your camp, everybody.